So this is just a quick little Dropbox that I set up with some resources to help you along with the class for today and in the future in general. These are sort of a couple images that I put together of just sort of the shortcuts that we'll be covering today, as well as just sort of basic overview of the interface. And we are using R24. So if you do have another one, a lot of this will apply to that, but there might be some specific things that will be on R24. So if you do have R21, make sure you go back and download. If you do have R21, make sure you go back and download R24 if you want to follow exactly along with what we're doing. But R21 will be able to do like 99% of the things that we'll be covering in this class. I don't think there's anything too specific, unless someone suggests something that they're really interested in, that we'll cover here. You downloaded both for some reason. Okay, I mean, if you have the hard drive space, I guess go for it, but you only need the latest one for this class. But yeah, so that's what's up here, and you might be able to tell that I also made this in a 3D program, Cinema 4D, of course. So this project file is actually here as well, which is actually what I'm going to jump into now. So let me open up Cinema 4D, and I'm just going to open up this file that we just have right here, just so you can see it. All right, so let me bring up my sort of outlines here. So when I'm doing these lessons, on the bottom left here, I do have something that will bring up the keys that I hit on the keyboard. So in case for whatever reason I don't say what keys I'm hitting, you should see them at the bottom left here. It will disappear after a period of time, but just so you know, the keys will show up on the screen of what I'm actually hitting. I know sometimes that viewing this through Blackboard can be a bit wonky, so that's why I'm also recording this, so you can check it out later in case something's like, you know, pixelated or the download upload speed isn't that good. So just so that you're aware of everything that we have set up here, that's how we're going to be going along here. So let's get started here. So hopefully you have the files. But just so you're aware of, so once you open up Cinema 4D, after you have signed in, so hopefully everyone, once you do figure out how to get everything set up with On the Hub, you will be able to sign into the license manager. So usually you can't even download this without actually having this. So yeah, so you can see that I have this set up here, so you might have to log into this. But once you have that, you'll have full access to Cinema 4D. So this is what you will be greeted with most of the time. This is the main interface. This might look familiar to some of you if you've used other 3D programs, or if you've used other, you know, design applications. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with some of the Adobe products, or other 3D applications, maybe Blender. I think some of you have mentioned that before. So hopefully the idea of this sort of interface isn't too unfamiliar to you. But just to do a quick overview of the general layout here, we have the menu bar at the top. We have different sets of controls at the top. We also have sort of our commands here. And these commands do different things or bring up different menus. Hassan there is asking about the asset browser. So if you're looking to check out the asset browser where all the free elements are, that is right up here at the top, almost in the middle of the whole interface here. And this would actually bring up your asset browser, formerly known as the content browser. So for anyone who is looking for that, that's where that is. Down here at the bottom, we have the animation manager, which is where you'll see the timeline and how you can control most of your animation for those of you who are really keen on getting into that. Then below that, we have the materials manager, which is where any of the materials, which are various different elements that you can add onto your objects inside of Cinema 4D to change their color, change their look, change their appearance. You know, to make them look really shiny, or to make them look like cartoons, or to make them look really design oriented. That's where you'll be controlling a lot of that stuff from, or at least adding them into your scene in the material manager at the bottom. And then to the right here, we have the attribute manager, which is where you will change a lot of the different properties that control your different objects in your scene. And then at the top here, we have our object manager. And this is where you will see all the different objects in your actual scene. So that's sort of the basic layout of our overall scene here. This might seem like a lot to some of you, and it can be a little bit intimidating at the first, but over time it does become a bit easier to manage as you get more familiar with it. And a lot of this stuff you don't actually need to use for everything that you're doing in Cinema 4D, especially in the beginning. So of course, feel free to play around with any of this or hit any of these buttons. You can hover over most of them and they'll actually tell you what they actually are. So you can see there that it says cloner, it says asset browser. So if you do forget what anything is, just make sure to hover over it for a couple seconds. And also at the bottom left, it also will tell you what you're actually highlighting as well. So that's the main interface here. So again, as I go through this, if anyone has any questions about what we're covering or you need me to repeat anything, feel free to just drop it in the chat or, raise your hand. I'm sure some of this, can be a bit complicated at times. At least it was for me when I was starting out. So this is the main sort of look and feel of the layout. And this layout is customizable. So you can actually switch it pretty quickly depending on what you want to do, or if you want to make it, perfectly suited for your specific workflow. Just a quick note at the top right here, there is the layout, I guess, pull out preset, and these actually give you different layouts for different things that you might want to do inside of Cinema 4D. So if I wanted to say animate, I could choose the first one, and it switches my layout into more of a animation focused layout. So there's a couple different ones here, and as we go through the course we will switch these depending on what we want to do, and feel free to switch these at any time for your own personal use if there's something that you feel like you need or that would be more helpful towards what you're actually doing at the time. But to start out, we'll be just in the standard layout, just sort of the startup layout that comes with Cinema 4D, just so that you all know where I'm actually at. So that's the main look of the scene here. So what I'm going to jump into now is just a couple ideas on some commands that'll help you actually navigate inside of 3D space. So if you're not familiar, using a 3D application or any sort of, I guess, design-oriented application, you're going to have to navigate inside of the space of the world. So inside of Cinema 4D, which is a 3D application, there are 3 axes of how you move around in space. So I guess the question that I always ask here is, does anyone know what the 3 axes or 3 ways of moving inside of Cinema 4D or any 3D application is? And if you know After Effects, you might already have it let up on this. And it looks like we got some people in here who definitely know. So we got X, Y, and Z. So X, Y, and Z are the different sort of coordinates, different ways that you can move in the space here. And inside of Cinema 4D, you can actually use different commands to actually move around in our 3D space. And those first ones that we're going to be looking at are using the 1, 2, and 3 keys, or Alt and left click, Alt and right mouse click, or Alt and middle mouse click. So these are the sort of the shortcuts for moving around in our 3D space here. Now, I will say that if you're doing 3D stuff, it does help a lot to have a mouse, like a real 3-button mouse. You can use a touchpad if you are working on a laptop, but but just just so you're aware, some things might be harder to do than others if you're not using a mouse. Now, the good thing about Cinema 4D is that even if you don't have a mouse, or you don't like using touchpad, there are actually commands up here at the top left that do the same exact thing as the 1, 2, and 3, or pan, zoom, and rotate. So you can actually click these and actually move around your scene without needing to use any sort of shortcut keys. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that, because I know some people don't have mouses and they find it a bit hard to navigate inside of Cinema 4D. So I just want to make sure that people are aware of that option. So those are the main sort of ways that you're going to be navigating inside of Cinema 4D. Different programs have different ways of doing this. I'm sure some of you who use other applications are familiar with sort of the differences in different programs. But that's what we have here inside of Cinema 4D. And these can all, of course, be changed and customized. So if you find out later on that you don't like using 1, 2, and 3, or the Alt button and the mouse button, of course, you're welcome to change it. And if anyone needs help on figuring that out, just reach out to me and I can help you with that. Moving on here, we have some transform shortcuts, and right here we have E, R, and T, and those relate to move, rotate, and scale. S is not scale for most of these 3D applications, because usually it's bound to something else. It's also not exactly in the top row of the keyboard, so that's also probably another reason why it's not S. But that's what you're going to be using to actually manipulate different objects inside of Cinema 4D. And we're going to go over this again in a second when we actually find a figure and actually start moving stuff inside of Cinema 4D. But I'm just bringing this up now just so that you're aware of it. And then a couple other ones that we have here that are just handy in general to have is just sort of knowing to copy and paste, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So that also applies inside of Cinema 4D. If you need to copy paste really fast, Control C, Control V, it's definitely a good thing to know. And you'll notice that over here I actually have sort of not that many icons or many elements in here, and that's because I actually group things together. So there's actually a lot of different items inside of here, but using the Alt-G command, I'm actually able to group things together to sort of declutter my interface here. So that's where Alt-G comes into play. Shift-C is actually a handy little shortcut. Once you learn what the different items are inside of Cinema 4D, you can actually just search for stuff like a cube, and you can just add that quickly into your scene. It's just something that comes in pretty handy once you start knowing the names of things, so you don't actually have to go around the whole interface looking for things. Then the last thing here is just our selection tools, which is the shortcut is 0 and 9, and this icon is actually up here. So if I hit 0 and 9, hide that. If I actually hit 0 and 9, you'll see that this is actually switching at the top here. And that's how you can actually choose your different ways of selecting objects inside of Cinema 4D. So drag selecting, which I'm sure if you're used to using design programs, you're probably familiar with, and sort of going with just a direct selection tool of just a sort of, normal mouse click. So those are sort of the main shortcuts that I have here. There are tons of more shortcuts inside of Cinema 4D. In the Dropbox here, there's a C4D shortcuts list that I pulled from the manual. So if you really want to go crazy with knowing all the shortcuts, they're here, go at it. There's no requirement to learn these immediately for anything. You can learn them as you go. I'm definitely not going to do any sort of forced quizzes on this. It might be extra credit quizzes on sort of if you know some of the shortcuts, the main ones, but I'm not going to test you on knowing any of the sort of shortcut keys, since that's something you just sort of learn over time. But yeah, so that's sort of the main sort of shortcuts intro to everything inside of Cinema 4D. Again, anyone has any questions or they misheard me say something, please feel free to ask your questions at any time here. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to actually start to actually manipulate stuff inside of Cinema 4D. So I'm just going to make a new scene inside of Cinema 4D. The shortcut for that is Control N, but you can just go up to top menu and do File, New Project. But unless you happen to have this project open right now, you might already be inside of a blank scene. And what we're going to do is we're just going to add an object into our scene. And a lot of times people like to start with like the cube because it's pretty simple to use inside of any application, but I try to use something slightly more fun, and I actually go with a figure. So inside of Cinema 4D, yes, I definitely am. Thank you for double checking that, because sometimes I don't start the recording. But yeah, so yeah, if you do miss anything or you have to like jump out or anything like that, I am recording this. And if anyone's looked at the email that I sent out for the last class, there is a YouTube playlist with all the videos that I'll do for the class, so those will all be there for you to access at any time. So yeah, so with that, at the top here, I'm going to actually click my left mouse button and hold on the cube icon, and up here you'll see that there are a number of different objects that we can actually add into our scene. We have the cube, we have a spear, we have a cone, we have text, but what I'm actually going to add in here is a figure. So if I release the mouse button on the figure, you'll see that now I have just a plain solitary figure inside my scene, and using the 1, 2, and 3 keys, I'm able to move around in my scene. So 3 specifically, as you can see on the bottom left here, is what I'm using to actually rotate in my scene. 2 is what I'm using to actually move in and out on my figure, and then the 1 key is what I'm using to pan around. And again, you can also use the Alt key to do all of this, or you can also use the keys at the top, or the buttons at the top right here, to pan around your scene, to zoom in and out, and to manipulate around your figure. So that's going to be how we're going to be moving around in our scene. So now what we're going to do, so again, if you're moving around in your scene and you have your figure selected, you'll see that there are, depending on which move, rotate, or scale tool you have selected, you can actually manipulate your figure as a whole. We're actually, in a second here, I'm going to actually show everyone how to actually pose their figure, but just to start off here, you'll see that being in the move tool, which is the shortcut E, I can actually move the figure around in our 3D space here. So if I actually click on any of these axis arrows, which coordinate to X, Y, and Z, as a number of people have mentioned in the chat here, I can actually move it around in 3D space. So Z here in this view actually points to forwards and backwards, and then the green line actually points to up and down, and then our red axis arrow actually points to left and right in this perspective. So that's going to be our X, Y, and Z. Now that's sort of something that is depending on your 3D application, so I just want to make sure you're aware of that, especially for some of you who are interested in other 3D applications. That's not always the same thing. For example, I believe in 3ds Max, Z is actually up and down. So just keep that in mind, that these are, you know, somewhat relative to the way that your scene and your world and your program is actually set up. So just keep that in mind. So that's sort of moving around in our figure. And then next to that, we actually have our rotate tool. So similar to before, if we're able to select any of these axis bands, we can rotate our figure around. We can move it, rotate it up and down. There's a number of different ways that we can rotate our figure. And if you're like me right now and you have your figure in an awkward position, and maybe you want to reset it, there's actually a number of different ways that you can do this. Of course, like in a lot of 3D applications, not all of them, because I'm actually learning a new 3D application that doesn't actually have this feature, but there is the undo button. So at the top left here, if you haven't already noticed, there is the undo and redo button. So you can of course come up to here and just click that and do undo a couple times to reset it to the way it used to be. Or Control Z also works as undo. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar using that. But if not, Control Z and Control Y is undo and redo. So that's how you might reset your character if you've rotated it in a crazy way or if you've moved it around in your scene. The other way that you can actually reset your character is with the Reset Transformations button, which is actually up here, a couple buttons next to the Scale tool, which is one we haven't looked at yet. But the Reset Transformation tool, if you click it, it'll reset your character to its original sort of default values, unless you've changed the values. So as we've been rotating this character, if I were to select the figure in our object manager here on the right side, you'll see that now we have the properties for our figure, and there are a couple different sections here, and you can see, and I'll zoom in here just so that it's obvious, there's a couple different tabs here, and right now we're in object, or I'm in object, you might be in a different one, but there's also coordinates, basic, and font, which is for materials. So the first one here is object and then coordinates, and you can see that here these coordinates here actually represent the way that we've been rotating our figure so far. So if I'm moving these, you can see that over here my values are actually changing, and right now you might be a bit confused if you're seeing HPB, because this is not what we were just saying, which was X, Y, and Z. So this might be a harder question, but does anyone know what H, P, and B stand for in terms of rotation? This is definitely a harder one, so I wouldn't fault anyone for not knowing this, even if you do have 3D experience, because these do represent X, Y, and Z. So in case you're confused about that, these do actually represent that. But yeah, so these are a bit harder. So HP and B is something that Cinema 4D does in a couple other applications as well, but it actually stands for heading, pitch, and bank. So if anyone knows anything about aeronautics, that's what these are actually sort of relating to, sort of your heading, or actually I guess no, seaworthiness as well. But heading, pitch, and bank are sort of your representations of X, Y, and Z from, I guess, a more aeronautical perspective. But in case you're confused and you don't like this at all, you can come down here to the order and you can switch this to X, Y, and Z, and then you're back to what we've just been discussing this whole time. So just in case you're confused about that, that's where that actually all relates to. So if I come up here to my reset transformations, I can reset that, and now everything is 0, 0, 0, back to the way it began. So that's our rotation there. And then our last one here is scale. And scale works in a couple different ways. Right now, you might notice that if we scale any one of these, it actually does it as a group. And that's because right now, our object is a full unit or a parametric object. So if we actually wanted to make it just taller, right now at least, we could only go into our object's properties in our y-axis and scale it upwards, and then you'll notice that our figure becomes this sort of tall man here, maybe almost a slender man per se. But there is a way to do that without actually messing with these values, but I do want you to see that these values over here do actually manipulate our figure here. So in case you didn't actually like manipulating things inside of the viewport, which sometimes is hard to grab items in the viewport, especially when you have a bunch of different items. It might be better used to actually manipulate things on the side here. Of course, this is totally up to your personal preference. Make use of this, or the different modes here as you feel comfortable with. So that's sort of our move, rotation, and scale tools. So the next thing, I think I'll show this really quick just so that you can see this, because I think it's kind of cool, is I'm going to reset my figure here, and this is new to R24. There's actually a couple new ways to actually manipulate things inside of our scene. So if you are using R21 or older version of Cinema 4D, or using the free version of Cinema 4D that comes with After Effects, you won't actually have these features. But just so that you know, there are actually a couple new move tools inside of Cinema 4D. Right now I'm left clicking and holding on this icon at the top here. So I'll focus on this right here. And if you left mouse click and hold on this, there are actually a couple other move tools that you can do. There's one for place, one for scatter pen, and one for dynamic place. I'm not going to go into super detail on what all these do, but just so you can see, if I were to switch this to the scatter pen tool and I have my figure selected, you can actually see that now I can actually draw multiple figures in my scene very quickly. So if you're ever needing to populating a scene with a bunch of objects, you can have a fun time just going crazy with this. So that's one of the move tools. Another tool that you have here is the dynamic place, and so you know about the cloner. So it depends. There's benefits and downsides to using the place tool. So there are some instances, or a lot of instances, especially if you're doing animation, where the cloner tool would actually be a lot better. But for just purely placing things, this tool actually might be better. But that's a good point that you bring up there. Yeah, no, so that's a really good point. And if anyone has anything like that that they can think of, please bring it up, because that's a good comparison point. Even if some of you aren't aware what the cloner is, which is a system inside of Cinema 4D to do exactly what it says, clone things, it's good knowledge just to sort of hear it, so that when it does come up, you'll be aware of it. But another tool that you have in here is actually the dynamic place tool. So I'm actually just going to create a cube here. So I just went up to our top menu here and added another cube in my scene, and selecting my figure, left mouse clicking and holding on our sort of new move tools here, I can go to dynamic place, and I can actually drag my figure and it'll dynamically move it in the scene and interact with other items in my scene. So this is sort of like you might have seen where I've done some dynamic stuff where things are moving around, but this is just for placing things. So if you need to place a figure or something on something else really quickly, this might be a handy tool to actually use. And there are a bunch of settings for adjusting this, but this is just another tool that you have here. Yeah, that is pretty cool. It's pretty neat when they add it, and this is a new feature too, so but this should help a lot. And then the place tool, which is left clicking and holding on it and going to the place tool, is sort of like the dynamic place tool, just that it just doesn't do all the cool sort of interactions. This is literally just for placing on it. That's a good question, Keon. So you actually can animate with dynamics inside of Cinema 4D. So one of the actual extra lessons that I have, which we'll see if we get to it today, is actually showing you how to do dynamics inside of Cinema 4D. So if you wanted to say, have a figure, and I'm going to do this really quickly here, just because this is like a extra thing. If you wanted to say have a figure drop onto another object, you can actually have your figure sort of fall apart onto another object. And of course I made mine sort of blow up here, but you don't actually have to have your figure blow up. I just sort of did that in this case here. What you probably would do is just do it as sort of a a full object and just have it sort of fall on your thing. So yes, you can do dynamics and animate them and do a whole bunch of crazy stuff, which we will get to. But for right now, we're just going to figure out how everyone can actually manipulate stuff inside of 3D space so that you can get to all the cool stuff where you can make stuff blow up and have things interact with each other. So yeah, so hopefully that's a little bit interesting there so that you can see what you will be able to do pretty soon. Probably in the next couple of classes, if not sooner. But of course, if anyone finds any of these things that I've brought up really interested and you want to like check them out ahead of time, or you would like a link to like a side tutorial on how to do any of this stuff, just get in touch with me and I'm more than happy to help you out if you're interested in this stuff. So right now I'm just going to reset here. And I'm just going to make a new scene just so that I can make sure that I'm starting fresh here. Feel free to keep your same scene. I'm just restarting here just so that I can make sure everyone, if they wish, are on the same page as me. But what we're going to go to now is I'm going to come back up here. I'm going to add a figure inside of my scene. And I'm going to move my camera, position it so that it's right in sort of frame here. I'm going to show you how to actually break apart this figure so that you can actually manipulate its arms and legs. The classic thing to do with these sort of mannequin figures is to pose them into interesting poses, or whatever sort of idea that you have for referencing. Usually I guess it's to sort of draw it, but in here we can use it in 3D in terms of a reference, and this is actually going to go into my next point inside of 3D, which is sort of how to manipulate things on different axes inside of Cinema 4D. So right now, for the most part, we've been manipulating things from sort of the world's perspective, and up here at the top left is our coordinate system. So right now we're in sort of the world's coordinate system, and you can click this and you can switch it to go into the object's coordinate system, which right now doesn't mean anything at all because we only have one object in our scene and we're only moving it in our world. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here to the top left, and this object here, and I'm going to zoom in here, is the make editable button. And this is what this is going to do, is it's actually going to let us be able to edit the individual pieces of our figure. And then, as you see here, the shortcut here is C. So if you do hit C on the keyboard, it'll do the same exact thing. But once I click this and I zoom out, you'll see that now our figure here is no longer sort of the normal parametric object that we had before. And there's actually a plus icon here that we can actually open up. And now you can see that there are different parts to our figure. So now we can actually go into our figure and actually select the different body parts and move them around. So if I were to come up here to, say, the upper arm, go into our rotate tool, turn this volume down a bit, I can actually select the green axis band here, and I can actually rotate the arm of my character. And right now I'm actually in the coordinate system, which means I'm actually rotating this based off of the arm's rotation rather than our whole overall world. And the way that you can tell that this is going to be different is if I were to switch back to the move tool here, in the coordinate system, you can see that the blue band, which is our Z, goes to sort of the top right here. But if I come up here to the coordinate system and I click this button again, and I'm on now the globe icon, you can see that our blue band now goes towards the back here in sort of the world Z space. So this might be a hard concept to sort of get at first, which is why I'm bringing it up now, just so that you can be aware of this, is that essentially you can rotate, move, scale items inside of 3D, either based off of, sort of the world, or, your world inside of your 3D application, sort of, up, down, left, right, relative to sort of what you have set up. Because like I said before, X, Y, and Z is not always the same. But if you come up here and switch this to the coordinate system, then you actually can move it based off of the object that you have selected. And sometimes it won't actually be anything different, because if I were to undo a couple times here back to the way it was in the beginning, both of these are almost exactly the same. It looks like the upper arm here actually has a default rotation on it by default, or maybe I moved that myself. So if I hit the button now, you'll notice that there's no difference. But as soon as I start manipulating things, especially from in the coordinate system, then my X, Y, and Z change which way is up, down, left, and right. So manipulating different parts of the figure, like let's say I wanted to give my character in the right thigh sort of a kicking motion here. Now I can actually sort of manipulate it in this sort of way. And I can see that my X, Y, and Z, or my axis bands here, are different based off of that. So again, take your time. I'm going to give you time in class now to actually play around with this. I'm actually going to ask you to make your own sort of interesting, cool pose in a second here, and also give you a little bit of a break as well, since we have been going for a bit now. But I want you to get comfortable with manipulating your figure in 3D space. Again, we're not limited to moving rotation. I could go to scale, and maybe I want to scale up the knee a bit bigger, and you notice that right now I actually have just the knee joint selected, so it's actually not manipulating all the parts below it. So I would actually need to go to the knee, to the right shin in our object manager here. And right now I'm actually not selecting my axis bands, I'm actually selecting the space outside of it. And when you do that with any object, you can actually scale it all together. So right now, if I zoom out here, you can see that my character has a really big right shin, knee, and foot down here. So you can have fun with your character. There's nothing to say that it can't have bigger body parts than the other. I'm trying to think of one of the characters in a video game that has that, but there are plenty of characters that have sort of asymmetrical body parts and limbs. So you can get unique with your character, or maybe you want your character to have a big head. There's nothing to say your character has to be any sort of normal human size relation to it. Definitely have fun with what you want your character to look like overall, as well as setting your pose that you wish it to have. And of course, depending on how you're manipulating your object, you can actually hit the reset transformation button, and it'll reset to what it started, or what it thinks is its default position. Because you can see right here that when I hit the reset transformation, it actually went to the middle of the body, because that's actually where 000 actually is. So sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And as we go out throughout the course, I will explain how you can get more, I guess, detailed with how you set your default values. But for now, I really just want you to sort of get used to manipulating your object. So let me see what the last things here I have to share. And again, if anyone's having a hard time with this or any questions, again, please feel free to ask at any point. I know sometimes it can be a bit much, so I want to make sure that you can at least get the core ideas as well as possible. And of course, this is being recorded, so I will be posting this later on. But yeah, I think that's the main things that I want to show here. So what I'm going to show you now is how to render out your figure, just so that you can actually post it and share it with me during our little break here. So the last thing that I want to show everyone how to do here is how to render out your image. So if you're familiar with, most 3D applications or any sort of, design program, eventually you have to get your design, your creation out of the program and into a format that can be posted somewhere, social media, or sent to a client so that they can review it, or to TV so that they can air it on TV. It has to go somewhere. Usually, unless you're doing some sort of self-contained project, you have to get it out somewhere. So inside of Cinema 4D, there are a couple different ways to render your scene. The quick icons to actually do this are up here at the top right. So up here where we have some of our commands, we have a number of different tools here that we can use to render our view, render to the picture viewer, or our render settings. So if we were to render to the first one here, which is render view, you'll see that it does a quick rendering of what you actually have in the viewport. So what we've been manipulating this time is our perspective viewport. So when we're moving around using the 1, 2, and 3 keys, or coming up here to the top right and moving around here, we're manipulating our viewport. So we can position our camera, because even though I haven't mentioned it yet, we are actually manipulating a 3D camera. You can see up here at the top it says default camera. And if we click our first button here, we actually have our render view. So this is actually what we will be rendering. Now, of course, right now it's still stuck in our 3D program. So what we actually have to do is figure out how to save our rendering. And that's where our next button comes up to. So our next button here is render to the picture viewer. So when we click this button, it's going to render to what Cinema 4D calls the picture viewer. And from here, there's actually a number of different things we can do. But what we're going to be looking at specifically for our purposes here is we're just going to be looking at how to come up to the top left here and go to File, Save Image As. So like most applications, you can save your image. And in fact, your project file, you might want to save that as well. So what I'm going to do is, while I'm doing this, is I'm actually going to come up to my lesson elements, and I'm actually going to save my project, because I haven't saved it yet, which of course is a bad habit to be in. I'm going to save my project itself on my computer just so I can have access to it. And I like to keep things organized, so I have a specific structure that I like, but you can use your own sort of structure to save your projects. So I'm just going to name mine Figure 1. You can see here that I have a rendering that I did from before. So that's actually saving my project here. That doesn't actually save out my render. So if I click my image again, you'll see that this is going to render to my picture viewer. Nothing's changed other than at the top right here, or in my menu here, you'll see that it went from Untitled 3 to Figure 01. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, in the picture viewer, I'm going to come up to File, Save Image As, and here you can actually do a number of different settings. Usually for this class, I suggest rendering as either a JPEG or a PNG, just because they're small file sizes, and PNG is usually a good easy one if you're going to composite something inside of After Effects or any other compositing application, because it can actually give you alpha, which, if you're not familiar, that's sort of your transparent background here, which right now doesn't look transparent because we actually didn't turn on alpha, but I will actually show you how to do that. But usually I just say PNG or JPEG. TIFF is usually a big file format, so I usually don't suggest using that. If any of you are more experienced with doing like a sort of more complicated compositing workflows, or sort of like what they do in movies and stuff, OpenEXR is probably one of those ones that a lot of people use, or at least that's what I use in my workflow for that sort of stuff. But for this class, PNG or JPEG is probably more than enough to do. So I'm just going to choose PNG, and then I'm going to click OK, and then it's going to ask me where do I want to save it. I can save it in my same folder, and for me, I'm going to override. And then if I go into my folder here on my computer, now I have my figure saved out on my computer. So this is going to be the process that I'm going to give everyone like probably 15 to 20 minutes to actually do. Is to actually, you know, add a figure into your scene, pose it in a cool sort of action-oriented pose. So you'll see in my example here that I have my figure sort of kicking a spear or maybe a kickball. So thank you for asking that. So you're actually going to submit it to the in-class sort of Dropbox folder that I have set up here. So in the chat here, this should actually take you to a page where you can submit an image directly to my Dropbox. So once you do render your image, you know, take your time. There's no rush to do this. You're going to submit it there, and then I'll be able to check it out. So that's where you're actually going to submit it. So you don't need to email it to me. You can submit it right there, and I'll be able to check it out. It's pretty quick about getting that to me that way. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm just going to recap really quickly everything that I just discussed here, just so that you can sort of get an idea of what you're doing. And then I'm going to give you 15-20 minutes to, you know, pose your figure, set it up in a cool, interesting way. Feel free to add extra objects into your scene, so you can see that there are a whole bunch of other objects here. Some of these might be obvious what they can do, some of these might not be obvious what they can do. But you know, if you want to add more objects into your scene, that's totally cool. But yeah, so real quick, just to go over, so starting from a fresh scene inside of Cinema 4D, I came up to the top, I left click and held on my cube icon, I went to my figure icon, and then you'll notice that you can't move any of the body parts, and that's because you have to make our object editable, and I can do that by going to the top left and clicking the make editable button, which is the C shortcut. And then now that I have my figure editable, I can come up to the object manager here, click the plus icon, and the shortcut for doing this, just so you know, is control clicking it, and it'll open up everything at the same time. And now I would like to select any part of the body of my character, and I can manipulate it to make an interesting pose. The pose can be whatever you want. If you want to have your character doing a karate kick, that's cool. If you want to have your character maybe doing a One Punch Man move, that's totally cool. You know, whatever move you want your character to do, that's sort of, you know, action oriented, you know, something that looks like they're moving or at least getting ready to sort of move is totally cool. Again, this isn't like super graded or anything like that. This is really just to show that you're familiar with it and that you understand the sort of basic idea of being able to move your figure around. I don't know, maybe you want the leg to sort of be flying next to it. Maybe you don't want it to have, you know, a leg at all. It's sort of up to you in terms of how you want it to look. You know, maybe you want your character to have a bigger torso for some reason. You know, I'll leave it up to you to figure it out. And of course, I'm sure while you're going through this, you might have some issues that come up. So of course, you know, feel free to ask me any of those questions. I will be here to help you along the way. But once I get to a position that I like for my character and the look, I can move the camera around with 1, 2, and 3, and then making sure my scene file is saved. I can come up to the top here, go to render to picture viewer, and it's going to render my scene. And hopefully on most of your systems, since there's not much in our scene, it should be pretty fast. And then I'm just going to go up to file, save image as, and then I chose PNG for mine, but you could change it to JPEG. Either one of those will work for me to check it out. Click OK, and then save it to my computer. And then I would go over here to the in-class Dropbox. And again, if anyone needs this link again, let me know. And I can sort of add it to here and, you know, just fill out the form there that it asks. and then I will receive the file. So that's all I'm asking you to do for the next, say, 15-20 minutes. And then of course, once you figure this out, feel free to get up, get some water, go to the bathroom, you know, whatever you need to do in the meantime. Excuse me. You know, take some time to just set this up, you know, just get familiar with moving around.